I24 News, there is every indication Israel is preparing for war. A French warship is docked in the port of Haifa. And I24 News has learned other European and U.S. warships are on their way as 10,000 Iranian-led fighters mobilize in Syria just north of Israel's border.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is defending U.S. ties to Saudi Arabia amid anger over the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
There is no direct reporting connecting the Crown Prince to the order to murder Jamal Khashoggi.
And in Indonesia, more than a month after the Lion Air crash, investigators say the pilots fought until the very end to try and save the doomed flight.
From the I24 News studios in Times Square in New York, this is Crossroads with David Schuster and Tal Heinrich.
Israel now appears to be preparing for war on its northern front with Syria. I24 News has learned exclusively that U.S. and European warships are expected to arrive in the port of Haifa within the next few days.
The show of force appears to be in response to the heavy mobilization of Syrian soldiers along the Israeli border. As I24 News has been reporting, these Syrian soldiers are being led by Iranian commanders of that Islamic Revolutionary Guard Special Forces. I24 News defense correspondent Daniel Tzemach has the latest.
Well, for now, we know that a French warship is docked in the Haifa port, and without any known army drills or planned visits by the French Navy, its presence is indeed somewhat strange. Now, the French embassy says that it's there for technical maintenance. The Israeli military, though, has no comment and directed us back to the French. Now, the Western military sources have told I24 News that this particular ship has seen active combat experience in the region in the not-too-distant past. And other military sources from the West have said that this ship will be accompanied by a fleet of other European ships, making the explanation of technical maintenance a bit curious, to say the least. We also know that in the past 2 days, 2 new battalions trained and commanded by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, Al-Quds Force, were seen mobilizing in Syria, one near the Israeli border with Syria and another near Syria's border with Iraq. For now, we don't have a confirmed link between these two developments, but the context under which this is happening is of course significant, especially with American troops in close proximity to that Syria-Iraq border and Israel's security concerns on the volatile northern border with Syria as well as Lebanon. Well, we may be seeing a Western response with those European ships heading to Israel's northern port.
To discuss, let's bring in Middle East analyst Thane Rosenbaum and retired U.S. Army Major Mike Lyons, currently a non-resident fellow for the Modern War Institute. Guys, great to have you here. Thane, I'll start with you. You know, the official reason that I24 News has been getting so far for the presence of the French warship in the Haifa port is technical maintenance, and it seems to be much bigger than that.
It does, and at the same time, you know, military readiness, the preparedness of the IDF is the coin of the realm in Israeli society. Prime ministers have lost their jobs and been disgraced forever for not being ready. Even in the 2014 Gaza war, Bibi Netanyahu was very heavily criticized for simply not knowing that there were that many tunnels dug underneath from Gaza to Israel. So on the one hand, this could be an example of military readiness and preparation. The French, it's not the first time the French have been docked outside of Haifa. Just last summer and the summer before that, the French were there conducting joint naval exercises. And look at this advantage. The first time in Israel's history, 4 Western countries are headed essentially to Israel to either conduct naval exercises or to stand ready in case of war in defense of Israel. That's never happened in Israeli society.
Mike, what do you make from a military perspective of the strategy of whether it's Hezbollah, the Iranian-led commanders mobilizing some 10,000 of their troops and Syrian soldiers along the Syrian side of the border with Israel and Iraq?
Yeah, I think it is about preparedness and readiness. And when you move those kinds of forces there, the Navy in good old-fashioned gunboat diplomacy does project power. You know that 3 weeks ago, the USS Roosevelt went underway from San Diego to replace the Nimitz in that region as well. And they're bringing not just airplanes, they're bringing Marines, they're bringing other shows of force aligned with the Israeli government. Now you bring these European countries into the Mediterranean, they do a couple of things. They also project power to the east, towards the Middle East, but they also project it north when you've got situations of naval confrontations taking place between Russia and the Ukraine.
And Thane, how do you assess this tension when you bring into account these new reports on mobilization of new Iranian troops in Syria?
It's only can be explained in the Middle East, right? I mean, you know, Assad has not even finished his civil war yet. And is he actually ready for a war with Israel? You know, there's never an end to Iranian mischief. So the fact that the Iranians might have been training these Syrian soldiers is not surprising, but we don't have evidence yet that these are Iranian soldiers.
Could this mischief, though, simply be to try to test out what the potential response from the Israelis and from the West might be?
And if that's the case, David, what a great response to see 4 Western countries lining up with Israel in an instance to say, look, we understand who our enemies are and who our friends, and we're aligned with Israel.
And speaking of enemies, what's the more pressing, imminent threat on Israel's northern border? Is it Iran in Lebanon, better known as Hezbollah, or Iran in Syria?
Yeah, I think Iran's concerned first about Hezbollah and what's at their immediate front there, the Golan Heights in that region. But this is also a page out of the Vladimir Putin playbook. What the Iranians are doing, they're pushing something to see what the response and what the reaction is going to be, similar to what he did in Ukraine. And what reaction has been is a tremendous response, you know, from the West. So I think you know, the Iranians are fighting a couple front wars here. They're fighting a proxy war inside of Yemen. They're going to be oversubscribed very soon here in the Middle East. They're about to get over their skis, and at that point, a mistake might happen, and they might get into something they can't handle.
And Israel's been launching heavy airstrikes for the past year and a half, some 150 airstrikes on Syrian and Iranian positions in southern Syria. If it was a battle of 10,000 soldiers against what Israel has, how would that play out?
Yeah, David, Israel has also been collecting intelligence on that as well as those forces move forward. And it's likely they've got the battle plans in place, both on the ground and in the air, in order to take care of that. They have a technology advantage in that part of the world by 10 times. I'm afraid it would be no match if the Iranians decided to do something would be incredibly stupid to attack conventionally into what would be the teeth of a very large conventional force.
Thane, if we focus for a second on the threat from Lebanon, Iran's presence there is Hezbollah. The last round of war between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006 has been very destructive for both sides. Do you think another round is really likely to happen in the near future? Because Israel has been preparing.
Well, it's interesting, Tal, that Israel right now is engaged in the last few days in defense exercises on 2 fronts, preparing for war with Gaza, Hamas, and Hezbollah. This is going on as we speak, which makes it even more extraordinary that at the same time these 4 naval fleets from different countries are headed to Israel. Look, one thing we have to remember, Hezbollah actually hits things. Their capacity to fire rockets into Israel and to really test Iron Dome is of a different level and quality. So there's no question when Israel is thinking about fighting wars on 2 fronts, the war on the north is one that it's most concerned about.
And Mike, we saw that just a few weeks ago when there were, it seemed like laser-pointed, laser-directed attacks coming from Gaza. They would point at a bus and the bus would be hit by a rocket, and that seems to be equipment that's coming from Iran. So if it is Iranian equipment, Israel faces a different sort of challenge.
Yeah, and they'll have to deploy countermeasures that are closer to the ground as opposed to Iron Dome, which is more or less in the atmosphere. But again, the fleets that are going to be in the Mediterranean protecting that western flank, I think will give Israel a lot more confidence to go on the offensive. And they recognize in a military situation, it's about momentum and it's about establishing that and keeping it going. So once something starts, you'll see the Israeli Defense Forces likely move very quickly and combat it.
Do you think Israel could launch a preemptive attack?
Well, I think then they run the risk of what we've seen internationally when countries do that. And I think they've got to be very careful. They're going to have much more of that moral high ground if they wait. However, again, it's all going to be about the intelligence they collect and what they end up showing the world.
Retired U.S. Army Major Mike Lyons and a Middle East analyst, Thane Rosenbaum, thank you both so much for coming on. We appreciate it. Good to have you here.
So many threats for
so many
borders.
Complicated region. Still ahead on Crossroads, Russian President Vladimir Putin is blaming Ukraine for their crisis in the Black Sea. He says Ukraine's president sparked the naval clash a few days ago for domestic political reasons.
And Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is on the defensive over the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia. Questions loom in the U.S. Senate over the Saudi Crown Prince's involvement in the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. President Vladimir Putin is accusing Ukraine of provoking the naval clash between the two countries. Putin says Ukraine is playing, quote, a dirty game.
Over the weekend, Russia attacked and seized 3 Ukrainian vessels and 24 sailors. Russia claimed the ships entered Russian territorial waters. The sailors are now being detained for at least 2 months in Crimea, the peninsula that Russia annexed 4 years ago. The sailors will reportedly face charges, and if convicted, they could go to prison for 6 years.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko is warning of a full-scale war with Russia. But Russia's Vladimir Putin says Poroshenko planned the provocation to get votes in upcoming elections.
This provocation was organized by the acting authority. I think the sitting president is also involved in the run-up to the presidential election in Ukraine in March next year. I think the acting president is somewhere on the 5th line.
Poroshenko, not Putin. And by the way, that was the right translation, but the wrong video. That was Poroshenko. It was actually Putin who was saying that it's Poroshenko for domestic political reasons who was engaged in this, quote, provocation.
All right. To discuss it further, let's bring in former U.S. Ambassador to Georgia, William Courtney. William, Putin in his remarks today, he tried to downplay this entire incident. He called it, quote, a border incident, no more. And he was also trying to portray Ukraine as the aggressor force and imposing now martial law. What's Putin's game here?
It's hard to know exactly what game he's playing. Russia has been putting more pressure on Ukraine recently, including harassing civilian shipping coming up into the Sea of Azov. Secondly, Russia has been militarizing its presence in the Arctic Ocean, Black Sea, Caspian Sea, and now Sea of Azov. So it looks like Russia is trying to bolster its defenses around its western perimeter in general. It could be, too, also that Russia is trying to make another play to develop a land border between the occupied area it has in eastern Ukraine down to Crimea. Crimea is having difficulty supporting itself.
William, does Vladimir Putin have a point, though, that these ships, I mean, they were warned not to travel any further. They were near the coast of Crimea, which Russia annexed. I mean, he seems to think that the Ukrainians were looking for this kind of dispute.
The agreement in 2003 between Russia and Ukraine provides for passage by all kinds of ships that are Ukrainian and Russian through the Kerch Strait into the Sea of Azov. So legally, Ukraine was on strong ground. There's no reason to believe an argument that somehow this was illegal.
Well, but having said that, it was just, hold on 1 second. But having said that, it was just 4 years ago, of course, when Russia annexed the Crimea. So at least in Russia's mind, it's no longer a case of a 2003 law holding in place. It's because, well, this is now Russian territory because they have the Crimea. So
there is there is Ukrainian coastline also in the Sea of Azov, significant Ukrainian coastline. So this 2003 agreement has never been renounced. It's still in force.
I want to ask you about, if we're talking about Crimea, it has somewhat gotten off the headlines in recent years, since 2014 or 2015. But this incident is still a reminder that tensions between Russia and Ukraine are still running high and can erupt at any minute in this part of the world. Do you think the international goal in regards to Crimea should be maintaining the status quo or somehow resolving this crisis?
So the international community and the Western countries in particular have said they will not accept Russian annexation, occupation of Crimea. There is also an ongoing, a simmering war in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass area, where fighting is taking place and people are being killed. Over 10,000 people have been killed in the last 4 years. Russia is prosecuting that war as well. So there are two issues. The primary concern, immediate concern of the West, is to stop the fighting in the eastern Ukraine, to stop that war. So it has gotten more attention than Crimea in the last 4 years.
William Courtney, former U.S. ambassador to Georgia. Ambassador Courtney, thanks for joining us.
Meanwhile, Russian President Vladimir Putin says he will meet with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Argentina at this week's G20 summit in Buenos Aires. The murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi at the hands of the Saudis has strained relations between Riyadh and much of the world.
The Saudi kingdom maintains that the crown prince, who is pictured there arriving in Argentina, was not involved in Khashoggi's murder. Khashoggi was a harsh critic of the kingdom. President Trump will not be meeting with the prince at the G20 summit, but the White House says the president is considering keeping his meeting with Vladimir Putin.
Putin, by the way, also said today that he hopes to meet with President Trump at the G20 summit. All right, here in the United States, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said there is no direct link between the Crown Prince and the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Pompeo made his remarks after a closed-door briefing with senators and Defense Secretary James Mattis. Pompeo urged lawmakers not to downgrade ties with Saudi Arabia over the murder.
There is no direct reporting connecting the Crown Prince to the order to murder Jamal Khashoggi. And that's all I can say in an unclassified setting.
And the purpose behind this briefing was to outline the U.S. role in the ongoing war in Yemen. For more on this, let's bring in senior diplomatic correspondent Nina Larson in Washington. Nina, this was a classified briefing behind closed doors, but we do have a transcript. What were Pompeo's main arguments for the U.S. backing the Saudi-led war in Yemen?
Well, Sally had three main arguments, and the first, of course, was Iran, Iran, Iran. This is what this is all about for this administration. They argued that U.S. support for the Saudi-led coalition there in this very brutal and very unpopular war is essentially to curtail Iran's aggressive behavior in that part of the world. Iran is, of course, arming the Houthi rebels that are standing against that Gulf coalition there. He also made an argument that it is to combat al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and also some elements of ISIS. He also made another argument, which I haven't heard in quite a while, that this was to actually protect U.S. citizens who may be working in Saudi Arabia. There have been some Houthi missile strikes, attempted strikes on Riyadh airport, but it's not. That wouldn't be a strong argument for me to say that U.S. citizens are necessarily in jeopardy within Saudi Arabia because of this war.
And regarding the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Pompeo, of course, essentially exonerating Mohammed bin Salman, saying there's no direct evidence. But what is he saying, or what did he say when he was asked about, for example, the evidence that the CIA has seen and the absence of CIA Director Gina Haspel? She wasn't there at the hearing.
That's correct, David. That was a very conspicuous absence, and Gina Haspel was in Turkey. She personally went to meet with Turkish investigators, but we simply don't know what transpired or what evidence she sees. Mike Pompeo's comments there on camera when he came out of that briefing have some weight because he is a former director of the CIA, so one would imagine that he knows what he's talking about. But at the same time, the Trump administration is walking an extremely delicate line here publicly and regarding their long relationship with Saudi Arabia. And in these prepared remarks, and also in an op-ed this morning in the Wall Street Journal, it was beyond doubt that the absolute priority of the administration was to keep that alliance extremely strong. Much of this hearing was about how Saudi Arabia and the U.S. Work together as a force for stability in the region, that they're absolutely critical for U.S. national security. It really seemed just almost a sort of, I hate to use the word PR exercise, but the entire thing was very, very pro-Saudi today again.
Nina Larson, our senior diplomatic correspondent, reporting from Washington. Nina, thank you.
Here in the United States, 2 Iranian citizens have been indicted for a series of cyber attacks across the country. The suspects are accused of collecting some $6 million from various computer systems in hospitals and municipal offices.
They allegedly hacked into computers and used malware that forced victims to pay ransom to regain access to their computers. The duo reportedly collected over $6 million from more than 200 victims, including the city of Newark, New Jersey, and the city of Atlanta, Georgia.
Starting in December 2016, the defendants gained access to victims' computers by exploiting cybersecurity weaknesses. After gaining access to the computers, they remotely installed their ransomware. The ransomware encrypted the computer data, crippling the ability of the victims to operate their businesses and provide critical services to their customers.
The indictment, it's important to say, does not link the suspects to the Iranian government. It's been 3 weeks since the United States reimposed sanctions on Iran in an effort to get the country to curb its nuclear efforts.
The sanctions are designed to hurt the government, but the real pain is being felt by the people who live in Iran. I24NEWS correspondent Manura Al-Hamoud has the story.
More sanctions. This is what the Trump administration is calling for with Iran. Although the Trump administration is saying it is not targeting ordinary citizens, sanctions covering banking, shipping, and transportation do have an impact on their lives. Everyday items, such as diapers and medicine, are harder to come by as the cost of imported materials increase. These sanctions have already had a detrimental impact on many professions, especially civil servants, retailers, and manufacturers, some of whom have suspended production and laid off workers. In preparation of these sanctions, early signs of economic uncertainty caused Iranians to protect their savings and buy gold and U.S. dollars.
The sanctions are very much hurting ordinary Iranians. Now, the Iranian government has put in some social programs to at least protect the more lower income classes, the more vulnerable portion of the Iranian society. But the middle classes, the working classes, the youth, considering the unemployment rate, the inflation, those are the ones who are going to be impacted by the sanctions.
European nations, meanwhile, have been working with Iran to circumvent the sanctions imposed by President Trump to maintain trade and business ties. Wiring money overseas, for example, is nearly impossible now that the SWIFT, the international banking system, has bowed to U.S. pressure and cut off funds destined to banks to and from Iran. Iran expert Zvi Khan at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, or FDD, says sanctions need to be increased. Khan says Iranian citizens' discontent in the wake of sanctions will lead to more protests against the regime, which will eventually bring Iran to the negotiating table.
The purpose of these sanctions is not to hurt the Iranian people. The purpose of these sanctions is to hurt the regime in Iran. That's the ultimate goal. Now, these sanctions do include humanitarian exceptions, but at the end of the day, our sanctions are going to hurt the Iranian economy. And we know from experience that when Iran faces extraordinary economic pressure, then they respond in kind.
However, Iran remains defiant and unlikely to bow anytime soon, despite a currency that has lost over 2/3 of its value since the beginning of the year.
But there's also the psychological impact, this fear of a worse future that's going to come. And it seems like both sides are trying to play that psychological game. Both governments are trying to play it against each other. The U.S. government is trying to say that they're going to crush the Iranian economy even more than it is actually seems to be going to happen. And the Iranian government seems to be downplaying the actual effects.
Munira Al-Hamoud, I24NEWS, Washington.
David, remember that at this point, there are still 8 countries that are temporarily exempt from the oil sector sanctions.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of wiggle room, but it's interesting to see Munira's piece there about the impact on the Iranian people, because the bet, of course, in Washington is that as the Iranian people suffer, that will essentially generate perhaps protests and more pressure on the Iranian government to look out for their own people.
And go back to the negotiating table,
but it's not
maybe.
clear if it's really going to work. So.
All right, when we come back, there's a report. Paul Manafort's attorneys have been giving the president's legal team updates on what the special counsel has asked regarding the Russia investigation.
And a Chinese research team is defending their gene-edited babies. And now this man is claiming a third is on the way. Here in the United States, much of the political and legal world on this day has been buzzing over the latest twist in special counsel Robert Mueller's Russia investigation. The president's lead defense attorney, Rudy Giuliani, is now admitting that attorneys for former Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort were feeding information to Trump's legal team about the types of questions and evidence that Manafort was being presented at a time that Manafort was supposed to be cooperating with the special counsel.
And now legal experts say this could amount to obstruction of justice. Correspondent Emily Rao has the latest from Washington.
Overnight, another major development in special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. Rudy Giuliani, the president's lead private attorney, saying Paul Manafort's lawyers have been talking to President Trump's legal team about what Manafort has been telling the special counsel's investigators. Giuliani telling ABC News, quote, "They share with me the things that pertain to our part of the case." That revelation drawing this response from ABC's Dan Abrams.
It's starting to feel like he was on a fact-finding mission for the Trump team to figure out exactly what do they want, what kinds of questions are they asking.
The news coming after the plea deal between Manafort and Mueller crumbled. Mueller accusing Manafort of lying to prosecutors repeatedly.
I don't think there's any question he's playing for a pardon here. I mean, I think that by saying, I'm with you, prosecutors, and then not just not cooperating, but according to prosecutors, lying.
Giuliani says President Trump is enraged by how Manafort is being treated by Mueller's team. And the president tweeting his own narrative this morning, writing, "At least 3 major players are intimating that the angry Mueller gang of Dems is viciously telling witnesses to lie about facts and they will get relief."
That was Emily Rao reporting. Let's bring in senior Washington correspondent Dan Raviv. Dan, some new information is coming out about President Trump's written answers to the special prosecutor?
Yes, Tal, we can't independently confirm what the president wrote in his answers, but sources close to Mr. Trump are telling reporters that when the president answered in writing questions from the special counsel, Robert Mueller, Trump said he was not told in advance about that meeting in Trump Tower in New York in June of 2016, when a small group of Russians, including a female lawyer, met with Donald Trump Jr., with Jared Kushner, and with the then campaign chairman Paul Manafort. So if prosecutors think that represented some form of collusion with Russia, President Trump is claiming he knew nothing about it. And Trump reportedly wrote in his answers that whatever contacts his informal political advisor Roger Stone may have had with WikiLeaks or even with Russian intelligence, that he, Trump, knew nothing about those contacts. The president also has now told the New York Post that Manafort, Roger Stone, and his friend Corsi are courageous for refusing to tell any lies because, according to President Trump, Mueller wants them to lie, and he says that it's like McCarthyism. David Intel?
Dan, is the next big stage in this investigation, I mean, the Manafort sentencing, which will now go forward, and also perhaps the prosecution filing where they're going to outline more of the specifics where they say that Manafort was lying.
Right, because the plea deal with Manafort fell apart. He may well be sentenced on Friday. Who knows? It could be 10 years, 20 years or more if really he's no longer cooperating with Mueller and other prosecutors. At the same time, there's obviously a lot of interest in Jerome Corsi, whom we mentioned. He says he's rejected a plea deal with prosecutor Mueller. Corsi says he expects to be indicted at any time. And again, Corsi could be a connection between the Trump campaign and WikiLeaks to get hacked documents about Hillary Clinton and the Democrats. We don't know if this could involve the president. The president was asked on this day, are you thinking of pardoning Paul Manafort? And Trump said he won't take that notion off the table. David Intel?
Dan Raviv, our senior Washington correspondent. Dan, thank you. Let's discuss all of this with Dominic Romano, attorney and founder of the Romano Law Firm, and Wendy Patrick, attorney and political analyst. And Wendy, it's one thing for a group of potential defendants to have a joint defense agreement, but it's something quite different when it's a joint defense agreement that involves providing information while your client is supposed to be cooperating under a plea deal. Have you ever seen anything like this?
No. It's very unusual, but you could ask me that question about every monumental legal boundary that we've crossed during the Mueller investigation since May of last year, if you can believe it's been going on that long, and I would have given you the same answer. Now, that's not to say that it's impermissible, simply because we don't see it very often. You don't see somebody playing both sides of the fence. Are you a cooperating witness, or are you some sort of a co-conspirator? That's a false choice. It is entirely possible, as Rudy Giuliani explained, that they just are looking for information as to what Mueller's team is. Well, why wouldn't they want to know? It's not impermissible. The question, however, and why everybody's crying obstruction of justice, is the argument is, well, gosh, isn't this pardon dangling somehow designed to get Paul Manafort to say the right things? But obviously that's not true. You just heard his plea deal fell apart, and he's now going to be sentenced as if he never cooperated.
Dominic, what do you think? Did Manafort really intended to flip on the president, or was it all part of a game?
Well, we don't know what's in his mind, but we know the results, right? It's almost like a double agent. He's feeding both sides. It looks like he may have chosen the wrong horse here, and he may be wearing that orange jumpsuit for a lot longer than he was expecting.
And one of the reasons is that, prosecutors, in order to be able to tell the court that they know Manafort was lying, they presumably have other witness testimony, maybe from Rick Gates, his assistant, who is not playing both sides. Maybe it's documents, maybe it's evidence that Rick Gates and others have provided. So, Manafort could be in some serious trouble, and the people who are supporting Manafort could be in some serious trouble because they still may not know exactly what the prosecutors have.
Absolutely. Not only Manafort, but President Trump's team. Giuliani gloating about what could amount to obstruction of justice, the very fact of receiving this information. It's not illegal, but some would categorize it as highly unethical. And under the pattern of the circumstances that we're living in now that Trump's decided to go full Nixon, very damaging to the president.
Wendy, on Twitter today, the president made a very serious accusation. He said that the Mueller team is telling witnesses to lie about facts in order to get relief. According to what the president is saying, we need a special counsel to oversee the special counsel investigation.
Tall, Dominic, and Dave, we all know this is the way the president talks. He doesn't necessarily mean exactly what he says, and he's imprecise. That's why everybody's worried about a perjury trap. If that trap snaps in his written responses, for example, people are going to say, oh, yeah, but this is what he said. But was he serious? You know, perjury, both perjury and obstruction of justice, those charges are harder to prove than people think. You can't just say, well, gosh, somebody did this. It looks like circumstantial evidence, pardon dangling. You must be trying to obstruct justice. No, you need to prove intent. So, too, with perjury. It has to be a willful misrepresentation, not a reckless statement, not imprecision, which the president is famous for. It's much harder to prove both of those crimes. So even though, and I love Dominic's double agent terminology, even though that looks like what we've had, that is not enough to show that the president is even attempting to obstruct justice.
The president's words, his tweets, we've got a whole volume of information that establishes a pattern, and these indictments are speaking indictments. Mueller is methodically making his case in public, and I think it does not look good for the president. It's getting close to his inner circle, and we're seeing his upset. We're seeing his angst right now.
One of the issues that...
It might not look good.
Go ahead,
It might not look good. And I agree, you know, optics are bad, but that doesn't mean that legally they're going to meet the elements of obstruction of justice.
We'll see,
doubt
Wendy.
The president's
We will
frustrated.
see.
It's been 17 months. We will see, and I'm sure we'll be on together talking about it when and if we actually get there. But there's just a lot of elements, a lot more intent than I think we've seen thus far.
But Wendy, let me give you an example. Paul Manafort was part of the Trump Tower campaign meeting in which they were allegedly meeting with the Russians to get dirt on Hillary Clinton. President Trump has denied knowing anything about it, even though he spoke publicly a few days before about all this information he was going to have a news conference about with Hillary Clinton. The news conference never happened after the meeting with the Russians. The president's personal lawyer says the president knew about the meeting in advance. And then there's Paul Manafort. If the president has said in these written answers, no, I didn't know about the meeting, they've got to possibly, if they can prove otherwise, right?
Absolutely,
Depends on how he said it, Dave. It's a great... Go ahead, Dominic, and then I'll respond. Because I got a great response to this.
Manafort has been caught lying repeatedly, right? You have the Microsoft Word document when he alleged that he wrote that.
I want to give Wendy 20 seconds because that's all we have left in this segment. Wendy, go ahead.
It depends on how he said it. If he said to the best of my recollection and then made a statement, that's not the same thing as perjury. Perjuries are willfully false statements of facts. If you are misremembering something, that's not going to make it on a perjury charge.
Wendy, Patrick, Dominic Romano, terrific conversation. We will have you back because this story's not going away. Tal and I will be back after this with a little story about the holidays ahead.
California Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi easily won the nomination to become the next Speaker of the House of Representatives in a vote of 203 to 32. For more, let's turn to our senior national correspondent, Michael Shore. Michael, but this is only the first round, right?
Right, yeah, she's going to need 218 to win on the floor of Congress. She doesn't have that yet necessarily. There are 35 people who didn't vote for her. One thing you have to remember, people who voted in the caucus today are the delegates, people like Eleanor Holmes Norton, who represents D.C., the people from the representative from the Virgin Islands, from Guam. They don't have a vote on the floor of Congress. So that means she's going to have to peel away about 17 of the votes that didn't pull for her today. So that's going to be her job for the next about 3 weeks, Tal.
And Michael, how are you reading Republicans in all this? I mean, before this actually goes to the floor, do you get the sense that they may withhold all of their support from Nancy Pelosi, perhaps to try and embarrass her and to deny her the speakership until she can cut all of these deals to win people over?
You know, it's an interesting thing. I think right now you're never going to hear a Republican say that they support Nancy Pelosi. The president supported Nancy Pelosi, at least rhetorically, just after the election. He said that she would be a fine speaker. And there's a little bit of political, brinkmanship there because they think that Nancy Pelosi is a lightning rod for criticism. Though they ran lots of ads using Nancy Pelosi as a foil this year, and they lost 40 seats in the House. So it may be that that no longer is a tactic for the Republicans. We'll see as it gets closer. But I spoke to a member of Congress tonight, just now, actually, before coming on air, who said to me that this is not a done deal yet. There need to be concessions that some of the people that are opposed to Pelosi haven't given. One note about today's vote in the caucus, Pelosi allowed people to check that whether or not they supported her. There are people that ran saying they would not support Nancy Pelosi. She put a box there. You could check, I support, I don't support. You could take a picture of it, send it to your constituents, but you got to come back and vote for her on the floor because there's no other candidate running against her. That's what she said, David.
Michael Schur, senior national correspondent. Schur, thanks as always.
Yeah.
The cost of living for American voters is one issue that Nancy Pelosi, the Democrats and Republicans are trying to reckon with. And if Pelosi gets the job as House Speaker, the pressure, of course, only increase. Soaring costs are also rallying people around the United States and around the world.
The so-called yellow vest movement that began in mainland France is spreading. On the French island of Réunion, demonstrators clogged the streets protesting a fuel tax increase. The island suffers from a youth unemployment rate of 24%.
The blockades have paralyzed the country for nearly 2 weeks. Our senior diplomatic correspondent, Christian Millard, has more on the yellow vest movement in this week's Diplomatic Dispatch.
After French President Macron's latest declarations on ecological transition, the question on everyone's mind is how French authorities will be able to contain a huge protest against taxes, which has shaped up into a rebuke of the president, whose very first reactions has been to lash out at demonstrators asking for his resignations and calling him the Robin Hood in reverse, taking from the poor and giving to the rich. The so-called Yellow Jackets movement has its grassroots in rural and forgotten France. This broad-based citizen-driven movement is among the most serious challenges yet to what analysts and political opponents call President Macron's elitist, pro-business government. They protest a rise in fuel taxes and express general discontent with the fiscal burden in one of the most highly taxed states in Europe, where taxes represent over 45% of GDP. Many of the demonstrators say they did not scorn the government's environmental goals, but that their own survival was more important, and that's all about making ends meet. The spark of the protest is clear, but there is not much that unites the Yellow Jackets beyond their anger at rising taxes and the cost of living. In France, where protests are often highly controlled by one political party or trade unions. This is a movement with no recognized national leader, no formal structure or affiliations which unites voters of all ages, of all generations, from the far left, far right, even those who once supported Macron. Their new cooperation is a sign that President Macron has failed to restore their faith in politicians and that deep divisions remain. Macron has so far held strong and still insists that the fuel tax and gasoline tax increases are a necessary pain to reduce France's dependence on fossil fuels and fund renewable energy investments, a cornerstone of his reforms of the nation. All small fiscal gestures, promises of energy checks and rebates are dismissed by protesters as irrelevant to their daily struggle. President Macron has to make sure his response is not out of step and disconnected if he does not want the country to plunge into chaos, dragging his presidency down with it.
And that was Christian Millard reporting. In Indonesia, investigators now say that faulty equipment and safety failures are to blame for a deadly plane crash.
The Boeing jet plunged into the Java Sea shortly after takeoff on October 28th. Correspondent David Curley has more.
We have just received the preliminary report on that Lion Air crash off Indonesia, which killed all 189 on board about a month ago. The Indonesians point out that the pilots were in a battle with a computer system, a safety system on the brand new Boeing 737 MAX 8. More than 24 times, because of bad data and a bad sensor, that plane tried to nose down. The pilots pulling the plane back up to level. It went back and forth, a tug of war between the pilots and the computer, which was actually pushing the nose down. Now, the report does point out that there were issues with maintenance and that Lion Air needs to work on its safety culture. And for the first time since that accident, Boeing is questioning the maintenance of Lion Air, asking whether or not the change of a sensor was calibrated. And Boeing points out that the day before, another crew had similar problems and shut off the automatic system and was able to fly that plane normally. This, again, just a preliminary report. The final report not out yet. We don't know what actually caused the plane to crash. By the way, the Indonesians are still looking for the cockpit voice recorder, but time is running out. The batteries on the pinger for that black box are only guaranteed for a couple of more days.
And that was David Curley reporting. There is more fallout over the designer baby experiment that has been rocking the world of science. The Chinese researcher who claims to have genetically altered twin girls before they were born is now speaking out, and he's revealing that a third baby could be on the way.
The doctor is promising the newborn twins' health will be monitored for the next 18 years. The kind of genetic editing performed by this doctor in China is banned here in the United States. Many scientists fear it can cause unpredictable genetic defects in future generations.
Today, Dr. Hajin Kui defended his experiment to fellow members of the science community at a conference in Hong Kong.
For this specific case, I feel proud, actually. First, I must apologize that this result leaked unexpectedly, taken away from the community of the full data.
For more on this controversy, our guest is Dr. Bruce Conklin. He helped pioneer the use of CRISPR gene editing techniques, including the same one that was apparently used in this Chinese experiment. Dr. Conklin is a professor at the University of California in San Francisco. And Dr. Conklin, there's some accusations out there that this research in China has not been peer-reviewed. Can you clear that up? Is that the case, and does it matter?
Oh, absolutely. This was not at all peer-reviewed. In fact, the very few people knew about this, so this would not have passed any sorts of ethical oversight in any country that I know of.
So gene editing work is banned in most countries, also here in the United States. Why? What's the real problem with trying to avoid diseases in this kind of way?
Well, I should just distinguish between the gene editing. Lots of gene editing work is going on, which is perfectly ethical. And for instance, if you try to modify a disease gene, and the disease gene is for instance, something that is not, that fix is not going to pass into the germline, in other words, to the next generation. That's just fixing just one small tissue, and that is perfectly ethical, and there's lots of people working on that. What's different about this was that they edited a fertilized egg just as it was being fertilized, so that this mutation would go into every cell in the whole body, and then those cells carry not only the intended mutation, but perhaps some off-target mutation, which would be detrimental to the well-being of these babies.
And what are some of the mutational impacts in terms of what these babies may be facing now as they start to grow up?
Well, we really don't know. The genome is very large, and we have they were just editing a small, like a 20 base region, and the genome is 3 billion base pairs, and most of the genome we don't even know. Just essentially how it works and how it operates. So we know very little. We know a lot about very small pieces of the genome, but a large portion we don't know. And so it's really the unknowns that we're most concerned about, because this is this is the type of technology that all the researchers and societies have already said that this was way too early to go forward with such an experiment.
Dr. Bruce Conklin is a professor at the University of California in San Francisco. Dr. Conklin, thanks for doing this.
Of course, David, what this doctor in China has done is very, very controversial, and it could have consequences that we're not even aware of. But what would you say as a doctor to parents who carry a certain gene and they see this experiment and they're thinking, I could become a parent to a very healthy baby?
I think I totally get your point. I think in this particular case, it sounds like they were healthy to begin with, and they were simply trying to alter the genes to help have an antidote to certain diseases, perhaps including AIDS. And in fact, although the dad apparently is saying that that he had HIV, but a child can be born without HIV even if the parents have it. So,
and the parents volunteer. They agreed to be part of this experiment. Or
well, staying in California, where our previous guest was just from, there are some devilish pranksters who are stealing all the ornaments from a public satanic Christmas tree.
The tree was decked out with pentagrams and inverted crosses. The event in San Jose has private security and police to help protect the 550 trees.
The Satanic Bay group says they are not surprised, just disappointed by the thieves.
I don't know.
Maybe they should have a tree there in the first place. I don't know. Well, now from devils to angels. A little boy at the Vatican stole the show from Pope Francis.
Even the Pope got a chuckle from a little boy who broke through security. The small prankster tugged the sleeve of a member of the Pope's Swiss Guard.
Apparently, the little boy did not believe the guards were real people. They don't look real people. Who can blame the kids?
They're an enigma to me.
Yeah. By the way, speaking of surprises, I love this next story. We're going to end the show with it. The owner of a massive boa constrictor, he was shocked by his snake's sudden change in appetite.
Well, the owner dangled the dead rabbit in front of the pet snake. Then suddenly the snake, measuring 7 feet, bit the owner on the hand, and the snake held on for a minute before he let go.
The owner joked he might have to play dead in order to get free from the boa's grip. Wow. Tal, there's nothing that creeps me out more than snakes.
And snakes? I know.
Live ones, dead ones. I can't stand snakes.
Really? Even if it's like just to take a picture with it and you know that it's not really dangerous, just with this appearance?
No way. Even if you were holding the snake, there's no way I could go near it. But the thing that's so creepy about this is then also feeding a snake, like something, a dead animal. It just, ugh.
I don't know if you're more afraid of holding a dead rabbit or of feeding a snake. Okay. All right. That does it for this hour of Crossroads. Go play with your pet
Play with your pet snake. Just don't bring it to I24 News. We will all be happy. More news after this.